Kara for the gracious invitation to come and talk about climate and water and all of these important issues. You know, water is the most important, #1 human rights issue in the world today, just by virtue of the numbers. I mean, today there's about 800 million people who have no clean water in their environment. And of course, you all know, you're the most tuned in generation in history. You all know the facts around climate change, extreme heat, flooding, and drought. So what Ali and I want to do is today just open the door a little bit, talk about some of the major issues around climate change and water, and we're going to profile 3 countries, as noted on the PowerPoint. India, where I've been several times, and Afghanistan. Ali is from Afghanistan, actually, and also Tibet. Tibet is a very interesting place. It's what they call there's 3 poles in the world: the North Pole, the South Pole, and then the Tibetan Plateau. So the Tibetan Plateau has 46,000 glaciers. But unfortunately, these glaciers are melting because of global warming. And all these major rivers that flow from Tibet, 8 major rivers are overflowing and then experiencing real severe environmental damage. So let's just, and then the other point is we really welcome your questions. In fact, for us, it's more interesting to hear what you have to say. So please feel free to jump in at any time with a comment or a question. And then what Ali and I will do after we run through the 3 country profiles in about 25 minutes or so, we'll just turn the floor over to you and welcome your comments or your questions. So let's just start out with a little bit of a backgrounder. Water is a function of economics and equality issues. There's an 80-20 rule that we talk about in politics and economics, which basically 80% of global wealth is controlled by 20% of the global population. And these are people that mostly live in, you know, the wealthier countries like Japan, America, Britain, France, and so forth. And one thing you might want to note is that unfortunately, the burden of climate change, the burden of water scarcity falls disproportionately upon the poor. The poor living in countries like Bangladesh, India, China, Gabon, Laos, and so forth. So that's another big challenge, and that's why water and climate change is such an important function of economics. Now, when I was a young student like you guys, I had the fortune, a good fortune of interviewing Milton Friedman, who, you know, he was like the darling of the right-wing economists. You know, he advised Ronald Reagan, Richard Nixon, and many governments around the world. He won a Nobel Prize. And I'm thinking, you know, I'm sort of a liberal, like I'm a Kennedy liberal, and I thought, gee, you know, a right-wing economist, he's like a darling of the right. What would he think is the most important, you know, economic issue going forward? And I interviewed him. He was just maybe a year before he passed away, and he shocked me with his answer. He actually said that, as you know there, the biggest threat to the world economy is the growing gap between the rich and the poor. So obviously, what Milton, at the end of his life, was becoming a little more focused on human rights, human development issues. And certainly this was like 15 years ago, his warning is prophetic, because now we see that the gap between rich and poor is actually widening. Believe it or not, with all the aid programs, all the development, all the World Bank, UN programs, the gap between rich and poor in the world is actually widening. Pretty shocking. There are a number of human rights protocols that address water and climate change, like the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, particularly Article 6. There's the famous Dublin Statement of 1992. So what we see slowly since the 1970s is the growth of this human rights culture around the world through the UN, through declarations, through the Dublin Statement. So slowly a human rights culture around water and climate has been evolving, which is a positive step. A big movement, you know, it would be like the equivalent of landing on the moon in a way was when the UN in 2010 declared that water is actually a human right. Now, many of you would probably say, well, obviously water is a human right. I mean, that's a no-brainer. But here's the thing. Until something becomes part of international law, particularly supported by the United Nations, people and government don't pay attention. It goes back to Aristotle. He said people don't obey the law because they're not because they're afraid of getting, maybe they're more noble. He said people obey the law because they're afraid of getting caught and punished. So Aristotle was pretty savvy when it came to human nature. And he said, people may be noble, they may be caring, but at the end of the day, the reason why most people follow the law is because they don't want to get caught. Well, similarly with water, most governments are not doing anything around water and water security. But now that water is the international law, because anything that the UN does now automatically becomes part of international law, now governments and people around the world are paying attention to the fact that water is a human right and it's precious and that we need to conserve it and make it available to people without cost. I've been to India many times, and in India there's a big protest movement growing because a lot of cities are charging people for water, and these are people that are already poor, living on the poverty line, which is about $1.70 US per day. So we really see a growing concern around water, particularly how access impacts the poor. Really important point. Now, you're probably familiar with the UN Millennium Development Goals, which were not reached, but it doesn't matter. As long as we're trying to reach these goals, it gives us a target to shoot for. And they've been replaced, as you probably know, and Kara's probably mentioned in class about the Sustainable Development Goals, replaced the Millennium Development Goals. And one of them, of course, was to cut by 50% the number of people without access to clean water. Interesting that if you look at water around the world, so 98% of global water is salt water and obviously undrinkable. So only 2% of global water is fresh. However, because of pollution, half of global fresh water is undrinkable. So really what we're looking at is 1% of global water is fresh and drinkable. Does anybody know approximately the population of the world today? Anybody? Yeah.
7 billion.
Around there, yeah. So I think the 7.4, give or take a few million. Now get this, by the year 2050, which is only 31 years from now, they're projecting 9.5 billion people. So we don't have enough resources today to look after 7.4 properly. We're not going to have enough resources definitely by 2050. And if 800 million today have no clean water in their environment today, that number is expected to increase to about 2 billion, 2.2 billion or so by the year 2050. Yes?
Isn't an attitude not the fact that we don't have the resources, but how the resources are currently being distributed amongst the population?
Brilliant point. You must be getting an A in Kara's class. No, you're absolutely right. It's how the resources are being distributed, and that's a function of poverty and inequality, but it also is a function of climate change. For example, northern China is now becoming a drought region. Parts of Brazil, parts of India, for example, are becoming drought areas, which means that their ability to access is going down dramatically. So you're actually right, it's a function of both. Also, with water, there are many water waterborne diseases like schistophysis and guinea worm and river blindness. So the poor often use water that's not safe. And they're maybe illiterate, so they don't really know. And if they don't have anything to boil the water, like if there's no accelerant like wood or something like that, what happens is they get sick and repeatedly get chronic illness. And we all know that if you get diarrhea, you go to Shoppers and get Pepto-Bismol, but tragically, I think about 2 million children every year die of diarrhea because they're so poor and they have no access to clean water and they have no access to medicine. So it's a hugely tragic problem. Obstacles to clean water would be obviously poverty, lack of environmental awareness. A lot of governments around the world, again, sometimes because of indifference, sometimes because of poverty, they just don't enact responsible public policy around environmental protection and integrity. Another one is industrial pollution. China, for example, has this phenomenon now, and the government of China has admitted that they have about 500 cancer villages. These are villages with cancer rates 10 times the national average. And the Chinese government looked the other way when companies were massively polluting. And now these villages where the pollution and the chemicals were dumped started showing up in the 1990s. This is after 30, 40 years of chronic dumping. These villages started showing up with these terrible cancer rates. So the medical community of China started to look into the problem and quickly identified that they were pollution-triggered cancers. Like they're not lung cancer, which is predominantly smoking, but it was cancers of the bladder, the stomach, which are symptomatic of contamination type of cancers. And now the medical community has affirmed it in China, and the Chinese government has actually admitted it, and they're trying now to do something about it. So water contamination is not just about drinking the water, but it also has very tragic health implications, such as in China. Now, let's talk a little bit about India. India, 1.4 billion people, 1.6 billion by 2050. One of the highest ratios of poverty of any country in the world, and serious water scarcity and sanitation issues. This is some of the data, around 38 million affected by waterborne disease annually. There's the problem of diarrhea again. Little children who are so vulnerable and need protection from family, extended family, community, government, and they're not getting it. So these are extremely vulnerable children. From an economic point of view, water is not just a human right issue, it's also a health issue, it's an environmental issue, and it's an economic issue, because not addressing the environment actually hurts your economy. That's the lesson that China finally learned. China learned that if we destroy the environment, we actually get economically pounded. So that's one of the reasons why the Chinese government has moved aggressively in the last decade to address major pollution, environmental damage in the country. You're probably familiar with the Gender Inequality Index, Human Development Index. These are very reliable indexes, and India ranks in the lower third in terms of gender equity, and women tend to bear the brunt mostly of poverty. Interesting that women in most developing countries are the water carriers. They're the ones that have to go out and fetch the water. Women often who are poor and in a developing country may have health problems, but still they're the ones with their children who are expected to go out and walk 2 or 3 miles and collect the water. That's a distressing statistic when you think about it. And I've been to India, we've done some filming and some research in the slums of Dabari in Bombay or Mumbai. And for example, you'll see these people coming out of a little shack. 5 people might live in the shack, a family. And yet they have a cell phone. So somehow there's a bit of an imbalance there in terms of development. It's good to have a cell phone, but more importantly, sanitation, water, and hygiene is essential. Now, at this point, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague Ali, who will give you some overview about Afghanistan.
Hey guys, thank you so much for being here today. Thank you Dr. Ross and thank you Karen for inviting me here. My name is Ali. I am a student. I just graduated from Berea College in Kentucky where I studied physics. I came to Canada and I met Dr. Ping and I was approached by him to people who talk about my country and about the experience that I had in my country around water. Afghanistan, as we know today, is roughly 650,000 square kilometers of land in the south central region of the Asian continent. It is bordered by a number of very important countries, including Pakistan, Iran, India, a little bit of China, and some Central Asian countries. Here's some quick statistics to sort of warm you up for the water situation in Afghanistan. It's one of the poorest countries. Its GDP in 2017 was around 20 billion, which translates to roughly 98% poverty rate. The World Health Organization reported that less than 1/3 of the country has access to clean water, which also goes hand in hand with the fact that there are 2/3 of this population that are affected by waterborne diseases. Also, less than 1/3 of the country has access to sanitation, and it ranked 168 in the HDI rank instead of 15, which is pretty low. Now, Afghanistan, as arid and semi-arid country, has enough water for itself. It has a number of famous rivers. In the north, there's the Oxus. In the south, there's the Kabul River, which is part of the Indus Basin. But then also we have some dams. These are some famous dams. 16 important dams that support part of the hydrological power in the country. But its bodies of water are shrinking, which is a major concern. As I said earlier, about 2/3 of the population in the country don't have access to clean water, which translates to about 13 million. And this is more concerning when you consider that the population grew from 13 million in the 1980s to about 37 million right now. And this is a country that was war-stricken and people moved out of the country. So imagine if people are moving now back in, it's going to be more concerning. Another major issue is that waste and other pollutions are challenged in river systems. In fact, in 2008, there were speculations by the Afghan government saying that the Pakistani government dumps their nuclear waste into the Kabul River. But mostly it's because of neglect and decades of war, which brings us to the next point. Because of that much pollution into the rivers, there's more people dying of waterborne diseases than lots and bullets, which was an interesting fact for me. Also, years of war have led to neglect of maintenance and lack of personnel and technical aptitude to take care of our dams and reservoirs. So most of them are inactive. Also, our forests have been depleted by timber mafia, warlords. They've been used for local fuel. And then these two causes have led to they've contributed to longer droughts, to stronger flash floods, and crop yields overall, which has caused more displacement than conflict, and that was another surprising fact for me. There's also the recession of Hindu Kush glaciers. The Hindu Kush glaciers are mostly in the northeast and the central region of the country. The New York Times predicted that 50% of that will be gone by the year 2100, which is concerning also. Also, the droughts and floods, as you can see, this is a picture from NASA's satellite crop monitor that was launched into orbit in 2012. It shows in the year 2014, some northern parts of the country are facing very severe droughts. Now that's not all the news. There have been some positive work in 2009. The government made a new law which sort of defined some terms, including water resources, surface water, groundwater, watershed, activity permit, which were things that were not included in the official structure of the government laws before that. Water was something anybody could use. In fact, most of the water in the country flows into neighboring countries. And then there are some solutions and suggestions that I thought would help with the water situation in the country. If you have any questions, then we can talk a little more about this.
All right. As mentioned earlier, Tibet is a fascinating region of the world. They talk about 3 poles: the Arctic, the North Pole, the South Pole, and the Tibet Plateau. As noted before, there's 46,000 glaciers, and major rivers flow from Tibet downstream. 8 major rivers: the Mekong, the Brahmaputra, which goes into Assam state of India, and so forth. And what's happening is the glaciers in the Tibet Plateau are melting at a ratio faster than other glacier areas in the world. So scientists are studying this. But the other problem is that these rivers are rapidly overflowing. And so there's a lot of environmental issues related to Tibet, which, as you know, is now occupied by China. Here's a list of some of the rivers. You've got the, as noted, the Mekong, you've got the Yangtze, the Yellow going to China, Indus, Ganges, the famous Ganges River, the Brahmaputra, noted, which goes into Assam state of India, the Chenab, Sutlej, the Salween, and going through 11 different nations. So this is a very pivotal and powerful river system that's being threatened by climate change, global warming particularly. Interesting statistic, according to the UN, almost half of the world's population, from Peshawar to Beijing, live in the watersheds of these rivers. So it's a very strategic area in terms of water, environment, health. And water, of course, is the livelihood for billions of people in the world. Similar to other parts of the world, Tibet is confronted with climate change. The 2 major symptoms of climate change are extreme heat, drought, and on the other hand, flooding, sea level rise. So within those 2 areas are, of course, multiple factors that will come up. Tibet's very poor, so there's a lack of infrastructure. And of course, if you want to have mitigation in the climate's vocabulary, we talk often about adaptation and mitigation. That basically means the ability to push back on climate change, which of course takes money. So obviously the rich, developed countries can implement adaptation mitigation strategies far more effectively and successfully than the developing and the poor countries. I'll give you a quick example. Laos, which is the poorest country in Asia, Southeast Asia, just recently turned the corner on malaria. However, heating, global warming is going to make the malaria rates in Laos spike dramatically because there are going to be billions of more mosquitoes because of the wet, hot climate of Laos, which is going to completely shoot their health budget. They won't have the money to deal with it. It's just one example of how climate change impacts a poor country like Laos. And the other interesting point, though, is that climate change is one of those disciplines that is fascinating because it involves human rights issues, health issues, legal issues, engineering issues, science issues. So it touches on many, many areas of academic and science and research, and of course touches upon thousands of different types of jobs. And I mean, as you go into the world, some of you may be looking at careers in the environment, climate, water, and so forth, and that's one of the fastest growing areas of employment is actually in this whole area. Interesting fact with climate change and heat that we talked about, that temperatures in Tibet are rising 7 times faster than in China, which is, now China, northern China, for example, is becoming a drought region, which is a major concern for the Chinese government. But the ratio in Tibet is alarming and of great concern to many scientists, which is one of the reasons why the Tibet Plateau is melting at such a precipitous rate. And again, Tibet's ability to have water security and environmental security and adaptation mitigation is very limited and somewhat depends on the interest of the Chinese central government. Another issue that Tibet faces is the lack of resources, medicine, health, budgets, which again is dependent upon the commitment of the Chinese government, which took over Tibet in 1950. How committed is the Chinese government to developing human rights development in Tibet? It's a big issue. Interesting quote by the Dalai Lama that, you can live without tea, but you can't live without clean water. Water is a very urgent human rights issue in the world. Another interesting point around human rights is that with climate change, the UN is predicting by the year 2050 that there will be 200 million climate change refugees in the world. And that's a conservative estimate. Some experts that I've talked to who were interviewed in my book called Water Rights in Southeast Asia and India, several experts believe that we could be dealing with as many as 500 million climate change refugees by the middle of this century. So it is truly, I mean, all human rights issues are important, but certainly water security and the climate change issue vis-a-vis refugees is the most urgent human rights development issue that we face. Now let me just, before we go to your questions, there's a famous UN ambassador, Eleanor Roosevelt, who said that it's better to light a candle than to curse the darkness. So there are some very exciting innovations. Some of you may lead in these areas in the future, and that is, for example, some of them are rainwater harvesting, where you can collect rainwater from the roof or hut. We've seen rainwater harvesting programs in poor villages in India. So rainwater harvesting has been around thousands of years, but now that water is so urgent, we are focusing more on rainwater harvesting. The other one is solar power. There's also wind power. There's transition towns that were started in Devon, England. And transition town basically means a town that goes off the carbon grid. So the town will use community gardens, electric vehicles, solar power or wind power. And it's very exciting. And this movement of transition towns, that Kara may talk about at some point, has taken off, and now there are 4,000 plus transition towns around the world. So these are some of the exciting innovations out there. There's a new one, I teach a sustainability class, and a new one that's come up recently is edible packaging. And packaging that can be biodegradable in 2 weeks. So right now we put packaging into the soil, in the landfill, and it takes 200 years to decompose, and all the plastic cups and bottles, because most bottles are not recycled. That's the truth. So, you know, you put a plastic bottle in the landfill and it actually takes 200 years to decompose, but what most people don't realize is oil from that bottle leaches into the soil. So we've got to do a better job on recycling, and one of the exciting developments that the business community has come up with is biodegradable packaging, and packaging that's actually edible. John F. Kennedy once said that whoever figures out a way to desalinize water and do it cheaply will win a Nobel Prize and get rich in the process. So I think if you can get rich being green and helping humanity, let's go for it. Why not? All right, so at this point, let's turn it over to you and ask if you have any questions or comments. We welcome them. Ali? Yes?
I was just wondering, when you were doing your country profile for India, did you study at all the region of Punjab, which is the largest agricultural community in India?
We have, well, I've been to India a few times, but, you know, India is a fascinating country because it's got 1.4 billion people, and it will be the largest population by 2050 at 1.6. And a high percentage of the Indian labor force is engaged, as you may know, in agriculture. And here's the big challenge for India. The water tables are dropping rapidly. 50 years ago, the water tables were as high as 4,500 meters. So they keep going down, 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 and the average water tables now are 1,500 meters. So, yeah, I look at a lot of issues in India, and certainly sustainable agriculture. On average, 70% of water, clean water in the world, is devoted to agriculture. Well, if that water supply is plummeting, obviously we're going to have less water to irrigate. We're also going to have more drought, right? Food prices will skyrocket. Just look at the Food and Agriculture Organization data. That's pretty much documented. Which means that hundreds of millions of people will eat less and face more malnutrition and so forth. So these are all interrelated issues. If you want to, I have an article that was published on water security in India and China. And don't tell my publisher, but I'll send it to you for free, okay? If you want to reach to Kara, I will email the article to you or to Kara. It's called Water Security in China and India. It was published a couple years ago in a journal called Asian Affairs. Thanks for your question. Yeah.
How do you find the current state of affairs for water desalinization, and do you think it actually is a probable possibility?
Well, I do not know of a lot of recent advancements in that desalinization, but I know of a main method that they do, and they have a little lake by the side of the sea, and they go through many processes. It is still considered one of the most expensive processes. There's open question, but there is a lot of areas of science where we don't know how to use them, combine them to bring it here. And now that I can have the opportunity, one thing that I think is very important in this around this issue is the focus of interdisciplinary folks on this, because as you said, there's a lot of international laws involved, there's science involved, there's problems of morality involved, what are we doing exactly, but yeah, it's still one of the open challenges.
Yeah, and the other thing about desalinization, it's incredibly expensive. So only rich countries like Singapore or Saudi Arabia can afford it. And ironically, again, with the inequity of income, it's the developing poor countries who need it the most can afford it the least. So that's something, a bridge that we really have to gap. Yes, young lady.
Yes. This course is focused on Canada, although it's good that your
Yes.
presentation is bringing the rest of the world. So I wondered, what is Canada's role in terms of public policy, or in terms of promotion of water rights around the world, and also within Canada, there has been some discussion about government doing more to help the First Nations people with their water issues on their reserves. The Inuit, of course, are going to experience perhaps more quickly the effect of climate change in the north.
3 questions. That's good. Yeah, actually, you want my honest answer? I teach a sustainability class, and this comes up all the time, and even when you give these talks abroad. And my answer, honestly, I'd give the Canadian government a D. We are wedded to a carbon economy, and I get that. You need jobs. Just talk to Justin Trudeau about this. Why did he approve 2 out of the 3 pipelines? You need jobs. You need tax revenues. But we're not doing a good job of balancing. And the truth is, we are wedded to a carbon economy. The Liberals and the Conservatives get massive donations from the oil lobby. And look at Norway. You buy an EV, electric vehicle in Norway, you get a massive tax credit, and you get free parking anywhere in the country. You try buying an EV in Canada. I mean, first of all, they're very expensive. I mean, I salute what Musk is doing, but the truth is that the EVs are unaffordable for the middle class. And why doesn't the government give major tax breaks?
Well, they're not, the oil subsidies are still on.
Yeah.
And that's one thing that's been going down on.
Yeah, and on the First Nations file, this is one issue. I teach introduction to politics class as well as the environment class, and this is an issue that students come up to me angry. And I said, you got fired up about this issue, that's good. This is something you might want to take note of. There are over 100 First Nations reserves in Canada that are on a boil water advisory. So, think about your own community. Wherever you live, how many days would you allow your community, wherever you live, to be on a boil water advisory without burning down City Hall? Probably no more than a few days.
Didn't Trudeau promise that?
Yes, he did. And here's the thing: there are reserves in Canada that have had a boil water advisory for 20 years. That means, and some of you in this class are 20, 21. Can you imagine your whole life being on a boil water advisory? Outrageous, unacceptable. You know who's calling out Canada on this issue? The United Nations. And whenever the UN calls us out, which they've done repeatedly, then the Canadian government sort of steps it up because they don't want international condemnation. But our domestic policy and commitment to First Nations water security is atrocious. So these are good issues, and hopefully ones that you're highlighting in your class, because it's a major violation of human rights. And then look at our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Section 15, on equality rights. That's been violated. Section 7 of the Charter, fundamental justice, that's been violated. Section 35 of the Charter, Aboriginal treaty rights, those have been violated. So it's very clear that the First Nations community of Canada is egregiously discriminated against on a number of areas, including water rights and water access. Any other comments or questions? Yes.
I had a question about the privatization of water resources led by companies like Nestle and stuff, and how you think it should be more regulated in places like Canada, for example, where companies own our water resources. Well, to relate to the previous topic, people in our country aren't getting good water.
Yeah. Well, that's a very good question. water, should water be a commodity or water be a human right? That's the overriding question. This may shock you, but you can take Nestle or all of these different water companies, you can take 2 million liters of water. I was in Singapore a couple of years ago. Let me see if I have. No, I don't. I was going to hold up a $5 bill. You can take 2 million liters of BC water, and you Nestle and these companies pay $5. It's outrageous. And I was in Singapore at the National University of Singapore, and somebody asked that question. And Singapore dollar is same as the Canadian dollar. And I held up a $5 Singapore note, and people were absolutely shocked. So that's the truth. We are moving toward water commodification, which is wrong path to be on. And the other thing, think about this for a minute. All of these companies are ripping us off on water, and then they kick us in the head second time. Why? Because most people don't recycle water bottles. They throw it in the garbage, and it goes into the landfill. And these bottles leach oil and other chemicals. So therefore, they've not only ripped our water off, but they've kicked us again by polluting our soil and our landfills, which is just terrible. So to go back to your specific question, we are not making water available, i.e. the First Nations people, and also with our water resources being extracted for pennies. We're not doing a good job of that. And I'll tell you this, the day will be very soon when we start piping our water down to the States, because you got, as you know, part of California drought state, Nevada drought state, New Mexico drought state, Arizona drought state, parts of Texas drought state. So what we're seeing now is water crisis hitting parts of the U.S., and water, you may be aware, that is part of free trade between Canada and the United States. So you watch, America will come calling, give us your water. And you know, when you're 10 times smaller than the U.S. economy, we are very vulnerable to blackmail, whatever you want to call it, when it comes to water resources. So my concern is that water is being, around the world, commodified at an alarming rate, but also we're seeing that movement in Canada as well. Yes?
So, but wouldn't the solution for like just the Nestle problem, for example, in Canada, be like a higher price on water, which in its like for companies, but in that self, isn't it also a commodification? So there's the problem, and then you're like doing, you're working within it, like it's still commodification even if we're charging Nestle more for it.
Yes, and again, that's a public policy issue. How much of our water do we want to sell? How much do we want to sell it for? And what's the responsibility, the green responsibility of the companies who take our resources? These are issues that the federal, provincial government are basically ignoring. Because, you know, I'm sure you studied the interest group theory of politics, where, you know, powerful interest groups control the politicians and finance their campaigns. Maybe, Ali, could you talk a little bit about commodification of water in Afghanistan?
Well, personally, I know of some companies that are even my relatives working on it. They are bottling water. Recently, I do not agree with that. Water in the past belonged to the people. Whoever lived by the rivers controlled the water, used the water. Most of our rivers are flowing out of the country, so we do not really have any big resources of people or water. So it's at the very early incipient stages in my country. The problem of whether it should belong to the public, whether it should belong to the government, or whether there should be like a local council to come up with some sort of a mediatory role. Very early stages.
Can't help but think about Antarctica.
Pardon?
Antarctica eventually might want to be developed for that reason.
Yes, and the Russians and the Americans, now that ice is melting rapidly in the Arctic, and then you have the issue of permafrost. and passageway in the Arctic now is much, much easier. So the day is coming when there'll be a race to develop trillions of dollars of resources and minerals that are in the Arctic northern waters.
Maybe one last note. So perhaps the problem that we're trying to bring attention to is not a single problem of people not having access to clean water or fresh water. It's a problem of overpopulation, it's a problem of diseases spreading more concerningly across densely populated areas. It's a problem of displacement, it's a problem of food insecurity. So we just want to share our enthusiasm for possible solutions that we see are going to require interdisciplinary approaches. So just putting it out in the field.
Okay, well, thank you. Any other comments or questions? We thank you again for your hosting us and Tara, and also for your really important questions. We really appreciate it.
It's a very important issue. It should be getting a little applause for
All right, thank you.
So I'll be talking about macroeconomic policy for a bit. I've graded your small group exercises, but I have to